In the waning months of the Civil War, as the fractured nation edged toward its inevitable conclusion, the theater of conflict shifted to the Carolinas, where the seeds of division had first been sown. By early 1865, the Union set its sights on North Carolina, determined to deliver a decisive blow by capturing the Confederate stronghold of Fort Fisher. This strategic port, the South's last lifeline to the Atlantic, had withstood a Union assault just months prior, but the North was not ready to concede defeat. Under the command of Major General Alfred Terry and Rear Admiral David D. Porter, a formidable force of nearly 60 vessels and a well-coordinated ground assault prepared to strike. The plan was bold. Brigadier General Charles J. Payne would lead the U.S. colored troops to neutralize Confederate defenses under Major General Robert Hoke, while Brigadier General Adelbert Ames, alongside Marines and sailors, would storm the fort itself. The operation unfolded with surprising efficiency. Hoke's resistance crumbled almost immediately, and though the battle for the fort was fierce, the Union emerged victorious by nightfall. This triumph marked a pivotal moment, signaling the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. This event represented not only a military victory, but also a significant success for Grant's strategy of attrition, marking the beginning of the Union's campaign against the Carolinas. General Sherman was advancing. A month after the assault on North Carolina, Sherman launched an invasion into its southern neighbor. The objective was Columbia, with the intention of wreaking havoc in the already abandoned city. One Union general described the situation as akin to having a drunken soldier armed with a musket in one hand and a match in the other, an unwelcome presence on a dark, stormy night. The combination of destruction caused by the soldiers and the uncontrollable fires, whose origins remain uncertain, resulted in the city being more than half destroyed by the conclusion of the assault. Sherman himself stated, "Although I never ordered it and did not wish for it, I have shed no tears over the incident, as I believe it expedited our ultimate goal, the conclusion of the war." Meanwhile, just days later in the North, the Confederates encountered another setback. The Union's capture of Fort Fisher, followed by the evacuation of Fort Anderson on the Cape Fear River, provided the Union forces with a clear path to Wilmington, where they could meet up with Sherman and his troops. General Hoke, in contrast, was focused on establishing a robust defense of Wilmington while awaiting reinforcements from Lieutenant General William J. Hardee. Hoke's initial defensive efforts were commendable, earning him the moniker the Stonewall of Forks Road. However, due to a lack of manpower, the Confederate forces were compelled to strategically withdraw from Sugarloaf and reposition their defenses at Forks Road. Hoke communicated to Hardee his belief that they could successfully prevent the Union forces from entering Wilmington upon his arrival. Unfortunately, Hardee would never reach Wilmington, as General Braxton Bragg, who held authority over Hardee, instructed him not to proceed there. Remarkably, despite Hoke's ongoing success in thwarting Union assaults at Forks Road, Bragg subsequently commanded the resolute general and his numerous experienced troops to completely abandon Wilmington. They complied with this order. Meanwhile, back in the Union, as the conflict continued to escalate in the South, Abraham Lincoln's second inauguration occurred on March 4, 1865. Eager Northerners flocked to Washington, D.C., braving relentless rain and exceedingly muddy roads to witness this significant occasion. It is almost hard to believe that, despite the enthusiastic crowds, President Lincoln's popularity had waned at various points during the war. Among the jubilant spectators, there were still those who could not recognize the merits of their leader. One notable figure was John Wilkes Booth, who would later become Lincoln's assassin. Although Booth refrained from taking action at that time, he reportedly expressed how close he was to Lincoln and how easily he could have taken his life in that moment. Additionally, highlighting the prevailing tensions in the North despite the president's successful re-election, renowned abolitionist and former slave Frederick Douglass remarked about the inauguration, stating, "I felt then that there was murder in the air. I felt that I might see him fall that day. This was an ominous premonition. However, Abraham Lincoln did not fall that day, and the inauguration proceeded smoothly as the president delivered a compelling address to the captivated audience. It was a day of celebration and optimism, which would soon be starkly contrasted by the somber atmosphere in the South as General Sherman captured yet another city. Reports indicated that Sherman and his forces were struggling through the swamps of the Carolinas, raising concerns that the Confederates might unite and confront them before they could reach the coast. It seemed that there were many who lacked courage down in New York. Despite the circumstances, the Southerners remained resolute and unwilling to surrender. General Lee instructed General Joseph E. Johnston to take command of the Army of Tennessee and all forces within the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. He urged the concentration of all available troops to repel Sherman's advance. This directive came after Lee successfully persuaded President Jefferson Davis to appoint Johnston as the successor to General P.G.T. Beauregard, who had not met the expectations of the Confederate commander-in-chief. As Sherman drew nearer to a rendezvous with General Grant, Lee recognized the urgency of the situation, and Sherman sensed that a confrontation was imminent. On one side were the Union forces, split into two groups of 30,000, tasked with remaining vigilant against any Confederate movements. However, the Confederates were not yet fully united. General Hardee had just reached Raleigh following a minor engagement at Fayetteville, while the reluctant General Johnston was still en route to join his fellow commander. Viewing the conflict as a futile endeavor, confidently, Sherman had declared that he could defeat Johnston as he and his troops advanced toward Goldsboro, anticipating an imminent clash. Yet as more Confederate soldiers arrived, the prospect of a Northern victory appeared less certain. When the battle commenced, the Confederates initially gained the upper hand. However, the tide shifted when the Union forces launched a counterattack, forcing Johnston and his men to retreat under the pressure of Yankee reinforcements. "I can do no more than annoy him," Johnston remarked to Lee regarding Sherman, who had been poised for victory from the outset. The Union's momentum was unstoppable, and the South was acutely aware of this reality. It would not be long before the truth became undeniable for all. The Confederate spirit was waning, akin to a match barely protected from a chilling gust of wind. Both Lee and Johnston recognized this grim reality, yet they remained unwilling to concede defeat. Not yet. General Lee, along with General John B. Gordon, was not ready to concede defeat. Instead, they chose to initiate what would later be referred to as Lee's final offensive. As the conflict intensified around Petersburg, Virginia, at the end of March, Lee and Gordon devised an audacious strategy aimed at capturing the Union-held Fort Stedman. Together with Generals William Wallace, James Walker, and Robert Ransom, Gordon patiently awaited the opportune moment to execute his clever ambush. One of the general's sharpshooters, Oscar Whitaker, recounted the anticipation of that night, stating that General Gordon gathered the men around him while he stood on a stump, explaining Lee's position. He described the long line they were required to maintain, pointing out Fort Stedman ahead. He promised that if they succeeded in taking it, their names would be published in every Southern newspaper. Naturally, as seasoned soldiers, they assured him they would accomplish the task. He instructed them not to load their weapons and to wait for his signal to rush the fort, assuring them that 50,000 troops would follow closely behind. The troops then executed a dramatic ruse, sending a group of armed soldiers toward the federal picket line to simulate desertion, while their commanders shouted convincingly, "Oh boys, come back, don't go." The next sounds that erupted were those of gunfire and hand-to-hand combat. With a 3-shot signal from Gordon's revolver, the battle commenced. Even before dawn, the Confederates sprang into action. In a formation led by pioneer detachments, followed by columns of sharpshooters and infantry, the Southern forces advanced. The strategy of deception persisted as Gordon's commanders had already identified the officers of the fort, allowing them to masquerade as Confederate deserters or even as Union soldiers retreating. Amid the turmoil of the early morning darkness, the Confederate forces concentrated on their objectives. Battery 10 for General Walker and Batteries 11 and 12 for General Evans. Additionally, a cavalry unit remained poised to engage once the Union defenses were neutralized, effectively completing the Southern offensive. For the Union soldiers stationed at the fort, the situation was bewildering. Their night, which had been filled with sleep, card games, and the routine of guard duty, was abruptly disrupted by gunfire, the cheers of Southern troops, and the alarming presence of rebel sharpshooters in close proximity. Eventually, the fort retaliated with cannon fire. However, the Confederates, led by Captain Carson, successfully evaded the barrage without suffering any casualties. The captain then commanded his men to shoot any Union soldier in sight, leading to a swift wave of surrenders among the Northerners. Yet two entire Union regiments remained unaware of the ambush until they were directly attacked by the invaders. The prospect of a meaningful defense from the Union forces appeared nearly impossible at this point, and a valiant but inadequate attempt to reclaim lost ground under Brevet Brigadier General Napoleon McLaughlin quickly disintegrated as General Gordon entered the fort to relieve McLaughlin of his command, asserting that his troops had surpassed all expectations in their success thus far. If the Confederacy required a boost in morale, they were certainly receiving it now. Following the capture of Fort Stedman, the Confederates set their sights on the adjacent Fort Haskell and Fort McGilvery. One Union soldier recounted the next advance, noting that they were suddenly under fire from the right to the left of their regiment. The boys were resting in their bunks when the first shots rang out, quickly seizing their weapons and ammunition without taking the time to dress. Some were barefoot, while others wore only shirts and trousers. The regiment had been effectively split in half. The right flank sought refuge in some old rifle pits at the rear, while Cos B and G retreated into Fort Haskell. Unfortunately for General Gordon, the fort's defenders had been forewarned about the advancing army, and the rebels found it impossible to advance past the ensuing gunfire upon their arrival. Meanwhile, Confederate forces in other areas were also encountering resistance, as the element of surprise had dissipated. However, the Union soldiers were still struggling to maintain their positions. As dawn broke, the attackers were mere inches away from a complete victory, while the Union troops fired to prevent them from seizing additional forts in City Point. Confederates attempting to capture Fort McGilvery were taken prisoner, while others faced heavy Union fire. General Gordon was becoming increasingly frustrated. What had happened to his once promising assault? The Southern forces were not only fighting to regain the advantage but were now trapped. They still controlled Fort Stedman, but Forts McGilvery and Haskell remained under Union control, along with the territory surrounding Fort Stedman, leaving the rebels with no option but to surrender. Running low on ammunition and opportunities, General Gordon reluctantly decided to initiate a retreat. This retreat, marked by fear and chaos, was met with relentless artillery and gunfire from the Yankees, who targeted the fleeing Confederates. The soldiers had ceased their fighting, caught between the threat of imprisonment and the grim choices of death or returning home. Tragically, 2,600 Southern soldiers would not make it back. The devastating loss at Fort Stedman would soon be followed by another defeat at the Battle of Five Forks. At this juncture, General Lee was beginning to come to terms with the grim reality of his situation. Recognizing the futility of resisting the advancing Union forces, Lee ultimately resolved to abandon Petersburg and Richmond, allowing both vital cities to fall into Union hands, a significant setback for the remnants of Confederate resistance. Although the war was nearing its conclusion, the most devastating blow was still to come. April 9th would prove to be a pivotal moment for the Confederates, marking a dramatic decline in their fortunes. As Lee and his troops retreated from the besieged cities toward North Carolina to join forces with Johnston, they found themselves heading toward Appomattox Courthouse, pursued closely by Union soldiers. Many Confederate soldiers were surrendering or deserting, and few retained any sense of hope or determination. Lee found himself increasingly encircled as Union forces closed in on the primary obstacle they had faced for years. Once again, armed conflict erupted, surprisingly initiated by the Confederates. The resolute and ambitious General Gordon sought to launch another offensive, leading to a confrontation at Appomattox Courthouse. Initially, Gordon's strategy appeared to favor the South, reminiscent of the early successes at Fort Stedman. However, the situation soon shifted, and a weary Lee realized that there was no turning back. Defeated, fatigued, and devoid of alternatives, Lee lamented, "There is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Regrettably for Lee, who preferred death to surrender, the latter was the only viable option for his Army of Northern Virginia. Consequently, he communicated to Grant that it was time to negotiate. At 1 o'clock, in the residence of Wilmer McLean, the two prominent generals of the Civil War finally came face to face. Their meeting commenced with an awkward exchange of small talk, as the two men had only a limited acquaintance, their primary interaction having occurred during the Mexican-American War. The interaction swiftly transitioned into negotiations for surrender, during which Grant displayed considerable generosity by offering pardons and even provisions to the famished rebels. Lee would soon agree to the proposed terms, leading to the conclusion of the surrender. Grant had ultimately triumphed over his Southern adversary, yet when his troops erupted in cheers of victory, he quieted them in the presence of Lee, stating, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen once more." As Grant had proclaimed, the war had indeed come to an end, at least in the larger context. Minor skirmishes would persist into April and May, primarily consisting of desperate attempts by rebels unwilling to accept defeat. General Johnston and his forces surrendered on April 26th, followed by General Richard Taylor on May 4th, and the last significant army under General Simon Believer Buckner on May 26th, after the final battle and Confederate victory on the 12th at Palmito Ranch, Texas. With the conclusion of the war, the United States of America ceased to be referred to as a plural entity. The phrase shifted from the United States are to the United States is. Although the processes of reconstruction and healing would require time, they were expected to unfold. However, despite the eventual unity and newfound strength, the conflict resulted in an immense loss of both lives and resources. This war, the bloodiest in U.S. history, incurred a cost of $6.7 billion and resulted in the deaths of 290,000 rebels, 365,000 Union soldiers, 50,000 civilians, and 80,000 enslaved individuals. It marked the first modern war, characterized by advanced weaponry and technology, alongside the extensive destruction it wrought. Ultimately, the forces advocating for emancipation, unity, and industrial progress emerged victorious. America endured, though it did so at the expense of hundreds of thousands of its men, women, and children. In retrospect, the Civil War can be perceived as a tragic episode of violence that might have been resolved through dialogue and policy. For some, it represents a moral struggle between good and evil, or freedom versus oppression. The true significance and necessity of the conflict may remain a topic of ongoing debate. However, if you were to ask anyone outside the United States today, they would likely consider every American to be a Yankee. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to our channel,